Do you get the sense that American cities are on the decline? If so, what should we do about it? Our next guest offered some ideas during a recent presentation for the John Locke Foundation. It was dubbed a curbside chat. Bo Wright is Development Director for the group Strong Towns. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Mitch. Thanks so much for having me here.
Before we talk about the decline or not of American cities, first of all, tell us, what is Strong Towns?
Yeah, so Strong Towns is now in its 10th year. We are a media organization that's looking into essentially the development pattern of America, the kind of connection between the ways that our cities develop, the physical layout of them, the roads, the sewers, what they look like, the streets, and the municipal finances of our cities. And so I might be jumping ahead, but with your question about decline in American cities, what we see is a lot of cities, and when we say cities, we basically mean municipalities, so that looks like counties. It's not just, don't think just the urban kind of inner core. We see a lot of municipalities really struggling with their finances, and a lot of that has to do with the way that we've built our cities. Basically, post-World War II, we've spread our cities out, and that has financial ramifications. And so our organization is dedicated to kind of exploring that connection and then providing resources to city leaders and engaged citizens across the country to make their towns and cities stronger.
So you mentioned that this really has a lot to do with the way the cities developed. What are the ways that they developed that have ended up being causing some perhaps unintended consequences or problems that people didn't foresee?
Yeah, so what we see is a lot of pre-World War II development. A lot of kind of urban thinkers will divide stuff into pre-World War II and post-World War II. Basically, pre-World War II, to make it really simple, we built our cities around the basically walking. We built it around walking from your home to a local shop, whereas post-World War II, we built our cities around the automobile. And Strong Towns is pretty agnostic about where you live and stuff like that. But what we do is look at the math. And when we look at the math, we see that when you build a city or a community around the automobile, you end up spreading all of your infrastructure out. And it's very, very costly for municipalities. So, for example, one of the examples I shared in the presentation is Lafayette, Louisiana. So we have a lot of data on Lafayette, Louisiana, as well as other cities across the country. Lafayette in 1949 had something like 3 feet of pipe per person, whereas in 2015 they had 50 feet of pipe per person. And meanwhile, their population only grew basically 3 times. So if you're a city, what you should see when you look at that is your income and your population growth grew 3 times, but your liabilities grew basically 50 times. And you simply can't do that. As a city, you can't spread out in that way and remain solvent. So we see a lot of cities that have developed in this way, and today they're really struggling because of kind of the obligations that they have with road maintenance liabilities and maintaining sewers and all of that kind of stuff.
That is the voice of Bo Wright. He is Development Director for the group Strong Towns. Bo, some people are going to hear us and they're going to say, wait a minute, these cities developed this way because this is the way people wanted to live. They wanted to have big houses and big yards and not be all crammed into one central location. Is it a problem that is based on the way people have chosen to live, or is there some other factor?
Totally. And this is why I mentioned before that Strong Towns at least begins from a kind of perspective of being semi-agnostic about the development pattern. We didn't start as urban advocates or anything like that. I always point out, and I don't know if it's helpful or not, but Chuck Marohn, who founded Strong Towns and has kind of been the voice and the face of our organization, when he started Strong Towns, he was living on 5 acres outside of town. And basically, he was a planner and engineer and realized that the way that we're building our towns and cities is making us poorer as communities. And I myself grew up kind of in a suburban, kind of rural area, and so I totally get the need for space. I'm someone who might always live in a single-family home. That's just comfortable for me. But there's a guy here in North Carolina named Joe Minicozy out of Asheville, North Carolina, who we work with a lot. And his response to this question is he's an Italian guy and he's bald and he's a short guy. And he said, "Yeah, I want to be 6'2" and have a full head of hair, but you can't. No one wants to pay for that for me." And so that's kind of the response is yes, I totally get that, and we are not trying to bang people over the head and say you need to move within city limits, you can't have this. But we're trying to say there's a cost to this, and as a society we need to pay for that cost, basically the cost to live so spread out.
Okay, so we have the situation of these cities that have been developed in these different ways and in ways that, from the vantage points of strong towns, are very costly. Mm-hmm. What do we do about it? We can't go back and say, all right, we're going to knock everything down and rebuild it. So how do we approach the issue?
Yeah. So there's a few things to say. One is, what can we learn from the past? What can we learn about the ways that we did build our towns and cities? One of the first things we'll notice when we do that is that prior to World War II, we built incrementally. We made small investments over a broad area over a long period of time. A lot of the development pattern we see today, in addition to being spread out, it's kind of developed all at once. So when we think of kind of a suburban neighborhood today, it's developed all at once to a finished state, and when it's finished, it's at its peak value, its peak prosperity, and then it simply declines from there. We see a lot of places struggling with that. So one of the things we can do is learn from the past and learn to build incrementally and bring some of those kind of insights into the way we build our towns and cities today. The other thing that Joe Minicozzi and our organization Strong Towns always points to is cities simply need to do the math. So they need to account for their expenses. To give just a very, very rough number, we've looked at in Lafayette, Louisiana, they decided that they needed $20 of private wealth created for every $1 of public investment. So if the city goes out and puts in a road that costs $100,000 for the asphalt, the sewers, the pipes, all of that stuff, you need about $2 million of private wealth generated as a result of that public investment. That goes to pay for the police and firefighters, maintenance on all the stuff that it takes to make a city run. So cities need to do the math. What we saw in Lafayette is $2 and $3 of public investment for every $1 of private investment. In a lot of the rural areas, we see $3 and $4 of public investment for every $1 of private investment. So municipalities simply need to do the math and account for their finances in the same way that like a business might do, the same way that we treat our kind of personal finances.
Another question people might have after listening to us is, okay, this all sounds kind of interesting. What's this going to mean in terms of, are we going to see higher taxes? Do we need more development restrictions? Are there policy recommendations that you all are making that would have that kind of basic impact on taxes or development rules or that sort of thing?
Yeah. The reality is we couldn't raise our taxes enough to pay for our backlog of maintenance liabilities in a lot of cities. That's simply not an option. In places where we've done that math, it would look like a 46% increase on taxes today with 3% increases over inflation. That's not going to happen. We're certainly not advocating for that to happen. But we are not necessarily policy advocates. That's not our role. We want to kind of build a broad movement of people who are pushing for change. But we have had a number of elected officials, both at the mayor, the governor level, and recently some folks in Congress talking to us. And we have made a few policy recommendations that have to do with infrastructure, where that money should be spent, what kind of infrastructure actually has a return on investment. The kind of typical bipartisan agreement that we've come to is essentially saying we build roads, that creates growth, and that growth is good. One of the things that Strong Towns is pointing out is that not all growth essentially pays for itself. Some growth comes with long-term liabilities that far outweigh the growth that you can get. So what are the investments that we can make today that pay for themselves, rather than simply kind of adopting a build it and they will come strategy where we build all these roads and sewers and all this expensive infrastructure in the hopes that growth and development will come to our communities.
Well, it's certainly an interesting topic, one that North Carolina and other states are coping with. And as we do, we know that one group that's going to be following this closely is the group Strong Towns. Our guest has been Bo Wright, Development Director. Bo, if people want to learn more about Strong Towns, is there a quick way for them to find it?
Yes, our website is strongtowns.org, and you can read many articles. We post probably 3 to 4 articles a day on the website, and then we have a podcast, which is just Strong Towns as well, and that has a weekly and sometimes bi-weekly podcast.